Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke. I'm director of the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Friend or Foe, Bugs in Your Sustainable Garden. When many people think of the Lloyd Library, they think of plants, and they think specifically of medicinal plants. But we all know that plants don't live in a vacuum. And the collections at the Lloyd Library reflect that. In fact, our books on insects go back to the 1600s. We currently have on display an exhibition, Incredible Insects, that highlights some of those amazing works. I'd like to encourage you, if you live in the Cincinnati area or are planning a trip here, to come see the exhibit. Many of you had the pleasure of experiencing the return of brood 10 cicadas. And I use the term pleasure very deliberately. One of the things that we were reminded of when the cicadas arrived was that they can indeed be our friend. But let's face it, bugs can also be our foe. And that's why we're turning to three experts tonight to help us with that situation, friend or foe. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Hello, everyone.
Hey.
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 I'll start with Dom. Domonique is the founder of Brick Gardens, which is a series of gardens throughout the greater Cincinnati area, and I think spreading beyond that, that is an invaluable resource, especially to communities that are experiencing food deserts. And he also is one of my personal go-to people when I have a garden question. Scott Beuerlein is the director or the manager of plant, let me get this right. He's the manager of Botanical Outreach at the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens. Besides offering outstanding programs, he's one of the most knowledgeable people I know when it comes to plants and their relationship with bugs. And just to let the audience know that before we began the program, people on the panel were already picking Scott's brain for information. Cedric Rose is a librarian. Let's hear it for the librarians at the nearby Mercantile Library. And although Cedric is a gardener, he wanted me to point out that his focus is on studying and writing about gardens and nature, plants and insects, and that the real gardener in his family is his partner, Jen. So with that, I'd like to turn over the program to the three of you. I'd like to start by asking you to tell us about your journey. How did you come to be interested in bugs in the garden, bugs in a garden, and gardens as well?
I wouldn't say that I became interested in them. I would say that I was forced to become interested in them. You know, when Brick Gardens first started, the idea was to extend the growing seasons by being able to convert vacant buildings into indoor grow farms using either hydroponics or aquaponics. So, you know, I did it that way to try to avoid all of the elements that, you know, your traditional farmers would have to deal with. So I thought I was taking the easy route, but, you know, very quickly I found that if there's a food source, you know, and there's something that wants that food, they're going to find a way to get to it, regardless of what you do. So these pest insects can also get indoors and cause quite a bit of grief as well. So, you know, my journey is one of those things that's ongoing because, you know, I every time that we do something new, it introduces a new insect or some new foe to us. So, you know, there's a constant need for a notepad and a pen so that I remember to ask these questions to myself when I'm, you know, confronted with these foes. But, you know, at the same time, it did force me to research enough to find out that, you know, there's a lot of bugs and insects that I would come across or see and just instantly think, oh, this is not good. This is going to ruin my crop or something like that. And only to find out that those insects being there were actually, making the crop grow even better. So, there's a constant crash course. And at this point, I think, especially since the cicada swarm, I think I'm becoming a little less intimidated and more intrigued, to the point I find myself looking and researching bugs that have absolutely no bearing on what I grow, because they're not even in this region. So it's one of those things where you end up down a rabbit hole, but so far, so good.
Well, I guess I'll go ahead next. I was a gardener long before I was interested in insects. I didn't hate insects. I didn't really know much about them. I started out pretty much as an organic vegetable gardener, and that automatically sort of introduces you to the world of good pests, or good insects, and bad beneficial insects, and then the types that ruin crops. And that was kind of eased me into the complexity of the ecosystem, and how diversity fuels this balance. But when it really took off for me was probably in the early 2000s. I read a book by Sarah Stein. It was called Noah's Garden, and she was a great writer. She made her name really doing children's books, but then she really had this great scientific mind, and she moved to a New England farmhouse, and kind of learned how to landscape with the land, and how that included diversity of plants, and how that required a balance of insects. And that really just kind of introduced me to concepts that really just I hadn't even known before. And now, I mean, I've come a long way, to the point where if I go out in the garden now, I'm probably spending more time looking at the insects than I am at my different plants. And in fact, this morning I went out and noticed some whitefly type pest insects on one of my phlox plants. And it just amazed me. It was interesting. It wasn't horrifying. I didn't need, to go running for a spray bottle or anything. It was basically interesting, because I almost never see anything like that. And so I'm going to keep an eye on it and see who comes and knocks their numbers down soon, hopefully. So, but it's interesting. It adds such another dynamic to your experience of being in your own yard or outdoors.
Yeah, I'm not a gardener, but I've always helped out in gardens. And so my grandfather in North Philly was a lifelong subscriber to Organic Gardening magazine when it was still called that. And he was feeding a family of 6. So, helping him out in the garden, I, very quickly kind of grasped this tension between, not wanting to use pesticides, not wanting to sort of impact the health of your family negatively, but, understanding that an infestation could just wipe you out. And so I've kind of carried that with me my entire life. Those grandparents, my mother's grandparents, were also, and this really speaks to how, getting kids interested early, I think it can stick with them the rest of their lives. I carried that along with me. My dad's English, and gardening is a big part of England, although he's not a gardener, but we had a garden in England. That same grandfather got me interested in just birds and the natural world, and really taught me early on also about sort of the impact of DDT. Large birds really excited him because their populations have been so drastically impacted. I mean, great blue herons, raptors, of course, by this pesticide, which was largely used as to control insects. And so just always sort of been interested in that. And then later in life, I was given a subscription to Ranger Rick magazine. It was put out by the National Wildlife Federation. And we were getting ready to move to Cincinnati, and I got an issue of Ranger Rick magazine, and there was a feature in there about the insect house at the Cincinnati Zoo. And I just got really excited about moving to Cincinnati. I mean, I believe that's one of the first sort of like permanent exhibitions dedicated to one of the largest, would you call it a phylum? One of the largest, groups of animals on the planet. And I've always loved going to that. And It's just I think what Scott said, it's a garden is beautiful, but then the animals become, and plants move quite a bit, but the animals become these tiny moving parts that just add a whole nother layer of intrigue and fun to it. And of course, there's so much to talk about in terms of discoveries and mystery too. Scott, I think I've interviewed you for Edible Ohio Valley magazine twice, and both times you've kind of pointed out that there's just a lot that's still in your backyard. It's just still completely unknown that we're still figuring out.
A lot of room for citizen science in a lot of ways, where we can determine where insect ranges are. That's not even well known. Fairly frequently people are finding that new insect species, or that previously thought extinct one was found again, or that they're in a range that nobody knew they were. So science has a lot to learn still. I'm convinced we will never ever know all there is when it comes to ecosystems, because it's such a complex thing and the variables are infinite. But you can try, and it's a lot of fun, and it's good for all of us to move it forward.
We our program is Friends or Foes. So let's start with the friend side of it. How are bugs our friends, especially in the garden?
So I mean, they act as a predator to some of the insects that prey on our plants, right? So we do most of our starts and we do a lot of stuff in our greenhouse. And in the greenhouse, we do have an aquaponics system. So one of the things that became a quick situation was mosquitoes would get into the greenhouse. And anytime we were in there, we would come out and we were the prey at that point, right? So these mosquitoes were having at it. And the goldfish in the aquaponics system would help, right? Because if the mosquitoes get down in there, they'll eat them and stuff like that. But growing up, I heard someone say the insect room at the zoo. Growing up, that was the one exhibit I made sure that I would throw a fit so I didn't have to go in, because I didn't want to see all the creepy crawlies and things like that. And I knew for a fact there was going to be some kid in my class that wanted to touch a spider or something like that, and I just didn't want to be a part of that at all. Well, that fear of spiders still lingers today, but at this point, they help out a lot with the mosquitoes in the greenhouse, right? So typically when we see one of those big nasty looking spiders that's hanging up in the corner of the greenhouse, it's no longer the fear that sets in. It's one of those things where I finally feel like I have a companion, because it's in there taking down those mosquitoes. So yeah, I mean, and the thing about that is, growing up, my experiences, and I still cringe a little bit when people say or call me expert or even farmer, because, I wasn't formally trained on any of this stuff. I grew up on a farm, but growing up on a farm, you don't get to do the stuff that seems fun and things like that. You're doing everything possible to make the job easier on the parents and grandparents. So we didn't get to do a lot of fun stuff. So I remember growing up seeing my grandparents and my dad do certain things, because again, we didn't come from a lot of money. So pesticides, insecticides, that wasn't a thing for us, because we couldn't afford it. And not only that, but my elders, I don't know where they get the information that they get from. It's one of those things in I think African-American families where everything is just passed down through word of mouth. There's no book that your parents are giving you. But I would remember seeing my dad lay newspaper and cardboard around certain plants, and the next day it was the task of collecting that cardboard and newspaper, and I never understood what that was about. Fast forward 25 years later, I have these beetles all around my squash plants, and now I understand what it is, right? So after doing the research and figuring out, are these good bugs or bad bugs, I found out quickly that they were bad bugs, and then I could flash back to why my dad and my granddad were doing the things that they were doing. So it's one of those things where I just do stuff that I grew up seeing, not really knowing why I'm doing it, only to find out that there's a lot of benefits from it, especially when it comes to pest control. So it's just one of those things.
Of course, there's pollination. You know, I've heard various things. I don't know what's true, but routinely it's thrown out there that 2/3 of our crops are pollinated by insects, and without that, we wouldn't have those foods. So anything with a flower, you know, and a fruit, we wouldn't have. So we would have grains because those are wind pollinated. We have some things, but we wouldn't have tomatoes. We wouldn't have cherries or apples, peppers, watermelon. None of that would be in a part of our diet anymore. And you know, that's kind of a human-centric way to look at it. But if you expand out from that and realize that the flowers they pollinate, that create the fruits and seeds that we don't eat, but wildlife eats, you know, then you start to realize, wow, you know, this is really a huge part of everything we know on planet Earth. And, you know, without pollinating insects, and let's face it, they're in trouble in a lot of cases. I'm not sure what the world would look like, and I'm not sure it would survive.
Yeah, I don't think I could live in a world without pollinators. I mean, it'd be an uglier, harder place. I think something I learned recently that kind of illustrates Scott's point, but also, you know, speaks to the predicament that a productive farmer like Dom is in. You know, there's been a lot of attention given recently to bee hotels and, you know, the plight of specifically bees, you know, as pollinators, but they're all in trouble. But breaking that out, you know, within that class of insect, Osmia, you've got, of course, the honeybee, which is just, it's relatively new geologically speaking in geological time to our continent. It's only been here since like the 1600s. And then there's solitary bees, which are actually some of the heavy lifters really for pollinating. But in exploring this topic, I spoke with Justina Block. She runs a company out of Hyde Park called Osmia Bee Company. And so she's supplying leafcutter bees and green bees. Scott could probably correct me if I'm wrong, because I know she works with the zoo a little bit. To private citizens, but also to orchards, to these companies. You know, their productivity is solidly linked to, you know, the proximity of these pollinators, which are themselves in trouble. And what I was further interested to learn was that Justina has kind of plugged into like the research circuit nationally and internationally. This goes back a really long time. Some of the big studies in North America that have demonstrated, for example, the importance of those native bees, which are themselves, you know, they're reliant on native, or they're probably a little bit preferential to native plants. You know, she has been communicating with people and families that have been supplying these bees to orchards in California for generations now. It's a big business for them. They're supplying these bees, sometimes honeybees. They're collecting honey. There's a side benefit for them, but it's just solidly linked to our well-being. But I think so easy to overlook, unfortunately.
So we mentioned, a couple of you have mentioned pollinators. So how do we attract the pollinators, and what plants specifically can people use, and what do you use?
That's my sweet spot, I think.
So Scott question.
Flowers, you know, pollinators are called pollinators because pollen and nectar, and that comes from one thing, it's flowers. And so you want to have a lot of flowers, a diversity of flowers. You want to have flowers all season long. So from very early in the spring, when the insects first emerge or first arrive here from their migrations, all the way through summer into fall, right up until Thanksgiving, later. Even some winter bloomers are awesome because you do have those warm days, and those individuals get out and forage, and that's when they need pollen and nectar the most. So, you know, and if you're interested in honeybees, one thing that's very interesting about that is they are native to the Caucasus Mountain region, would be Iran, Turkey, Turkmenistan, and that area of the world. And you know, so many of the plants that bloom early, when they would be out foraging and really in need of food, are the bulbs that we know, the tulips, daffodils, but especially the minor bulbs like scilla and hyacinthoides and some of the smaller things, winter snowdrops and things like that. So if you're interested in honeybees, you probably want to have some of those. When it comes to pollen and nectar, I'm a little, I love native plants, but I bristle just a little bit when everybody talks about native plants, native plants, native plants. For pollen and nectar, it doesn't matter that much. Pollen and nectar is universal. It doesn't change from continent to continent. So, if summer can be a tough time. We think of summer as being heavy bloomers all the time. But, the way most people garden, let's face it, most people shop on Mother's Day. They buy all their plants on Mother's Day. They buy what's in bloom on Mother's Day. Their gardens look fantastic on Mother's Day, but the rest of the summer, it's kind of boring. Not a whole lot going on, nothing in bloom. So, annuals get disparaged a lot because, they have to be planted every year. There's probably a bigger carbon footprint. But if you choose the right ones, you've got great all season long flowers producing pollen and nectar for the insects. And now just to go back a step, because I don't want anybody to hate me, I never have really enjoyed that. But the real reason for native plants, I don't want to dismiss native plants at all as far as importance to insects, because a lot of our native insects have evolved to need a host plant, which will be a native plant, because it takes millions of years to derive these associations. So a lot of the moths and butterflies, especially that whole family, if you want a spice bush swallowtail in your yard, you better have a spice bush somewhere in the landscape. If you want zebra swallowtails, you got to have a pawpaw somewhere around. All these native plants, that's where they're really important. And a lot of these host plants are not typical garden plants. You have to go looking for them pretty hard if you want to put them in your landscape, and which brings out the importance of allowing some wild spaces to exist and making sure they're of good quality with a lot of native plants in them, not just green space filled with exotic invasives. So that's probably enough of that speech for just now. Can get back to it later if necessary.
So Scott, I have a question.
No.
And it goes directly to you said something about throwing, again, one of those things that I used to notice my granddad doing is, every season at certain times of the year, he would go to certain parts of the farm and he would just start tossing seeds around. And those would always become my favorite spots, because once all the flowers came in and things like that, it was just, I'm really attracted to color. So seeing all the different colors, the different butterflies that it would affect or attract and things like that, it was one of those things that I think he was doing it for the very reason that you're speaking of. But again, he never passed that information on to me before he went. So is there certain type, because honestly, what I've been doing is I'll go around to my farms. I obviously try to create pollination stations, right? So I've just started getting like a bag of mixed seeds, mixed flower seeds and things like that. And I've found myself doing the exact same thing that my granddad used to do, which was just find a patch and just throw the seeds everywhere. But is there any way to get more specific than that? Because I'm just getting like wildflower seeds. I don't know what's in it and things like that. But, is that kind of the same thing? Because out of habit, I'm switching the area that I do it throughout the season, and I don't know why I'm doing it, but I feel like that's what it's for.
That's fascinating to hear that story. And, I've got all these thoughts, it's like, maybe he was doing it to keep your grandmother happy. She liked it. Maybe he was doing it because he loved the butterflies, or maybe he knew that it would attract the beneficial insects that would keep your crops healthy. And what's fascinating about that too is that's old school stuff. That's how people did it previously, and we've kind of forgotten that in a lot of ways. It's relatively new for people to go to the garden center and come home with a flat of annuals. It used to be everybody would buy their seeds from catalog companies, and they'd show up and they'd throw them around, and it would be easy stuff like zinnias and cosmos and verbenas and different things like that, all of which are really good pollinator plants that really are attractive to pollinators. Unlike some of the more heavily bred, annuals that you see more commonly today. So I don't really know exactly, but all those things are coming together, and it probably is a little bit of truth in most of them.
Awesome.
I'm going to weigh in with the totally unscientific angle, if that's all right.
Please.
Anecdotally, I think, just to get back to the question of like, how do you attract those pollinators? What are good flowers, good plants? You can get out there and really use your senses and get a sense of like what is really attracting them. So I was just out in the backyard. Jen was making me pick beans. I was helping, and she was like, are you only picking beans because you're pretending to be a gardener later tonight? But I was really just trying to admire her bergamot, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, wild bergamot. And that's just, it's got these like raggedy heads that are just rich with colors. It comes in many different colors, and the bumblebees are just going nuts on them. And you can just see that there's a volume of insect life that is just working that patch. I saw actually a hummingbird moth on them the other night, which was, it was gross out some people, but they're pretty fascinating to me. And of course, I love the hummingbirds too. In terms of shrubs, and I'm not going to be exhaustive at all, but I have noticed also, maybe Scott can speak to this a little bit, like we have some viburnums, and the way they bloom is they kind of have that like flat, it's almost like it's offering a plate of blooms. Most plants are kind of like that, but structurally these blooms are so different because they have evolved like this specificity, I think, they've adapted to probably the pollinators that are getting the job done the best for them.
Yeah, you made a neat comment on our radio promotion on VXU yesterday about small flowers for specific types of pollinators, and I've noticed that small flowers, and even though that flower on a viburnum looks like a big flower, maybe just somebody who doesn't know or from a distance, but that's a cluster of tons of little flowers, and I think. I have noticed that those little flowers attract such a wide diversity of pollinators just across the board. Big pollinators, little ones, butterflies, hummingbirds. I think they've figured out that if they're small, anything can feed from them. The mouth parts work somehow. Whereas a trumpet honeysuckle, you pretty much have to be a hummingbird with a long bill and a tongue to get in there and do the work. And then things like orchids or iris, they have very complex, very specific shapes that are definitely designed to attract maybe even a single type of insect to come land on it, worm its way through whatever tubes and hallways and basements that it's requiring you to go through, pick up the pollen, move it, and so on. And gentians where, actually literally bees have learned cut their way in from the side because it's so hard for insects to get in otherwise. But it's just, it's really fascinating stuff. And there's a lot of methods and that flowers, this evolution between flowers and insects has just created a lot of, an infinite number of, means of pollinating. Yeah. It's just cool.
You just raised an interesting question. I'm getting nervous here because this is the Lloyd, and there are definitely some very smart people in the comment section, so maybe they could even fill us in. But I guess maybe it's fair to say that some plants have evolved to exclude certain things. I don't really understand fully understand the mechanism, but it's that degree of specificity would seem to suggest something like that.
Yeah, I don't think anything evolved to exclude anything per se. That's a byproduct of how they form to include a specific thing. So, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for a flower to deliberately exclude insects.
No pollen for you.
Yeah. But it also is a risky kind of path of evolution because it means it's totally dependent on maybe one or a handful of species of pollinators.
Sometime with pollinators, we hear talk about rest stops and food stops. Can any of you speak to that?
Can I kick this one off just real quick? Because I just have been thinking about this a little bit. You know, I mean, several of the major causes that everybody, I think, globally is agreeing upon for the decline in insect populations and crucially pollinator populations are, you know, habitat loss, but then to some extent use of pesticides. But when you think about how those two things interact, you know, I'm a little obsessed with the home gardener at this point, but you know, pesticide use on a large agricultural scale is definitely an issue also. But when you think about, you know, a lot of these pollinators that are migrating long distances and they're relying on those rest stops, as it were, you know, if you kind of put yourself in their shoes, it's kind of a bummer to get to a rest stop and realize that basically the vending machines have all been poisoned there or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it sounds a lot like the Pennsylvania Turnpike to me, but still. So yeah, I think you can. I think everybody should kind of like look up those root causes. But I do think sort of thinking how they interact is important when you're a home gardener and you're making those decisions, or if you have neighbors who are using mosquito control service. It's complicated though.
Before we get to pesticides, I did see that somebody asked in the chat, so are mosquitoes good or bad? So since you brought up the topic of mosquitoes, then we'll get back to pesticides, but thoughts on mosquitoes?
They're good if they're not on your arm biting you. They're bad if they're on your arm biting you.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. You know, with the one thing that I can say they definitely are bad about is biting me. So at that point, you know, it makes the work day a little bit more stressful. So in my opinion, they're bad if they're uncontrolled, because, you know, if you're a person like me, you're going to be a smorgasbord for those things. And that makes for a long, uncomfortable sleep at night. So.
Yeah, and, you know, let's face it, they have a long history of spreading some pretty bad diseases among human beings. But I still don't, that said, I'm not a fan of mosquito control companies, you know, soliciting to homeowners or homeowners even going and picking out one of the pesticides for mosquito control. You know, I think that really should be handled by municipalities or by state governments, who can decide whether, you know, the health risks of such and such mosquito population carrying potentially whatever diseases is worth some kind of control, and then, you know, using science to find the very safest, best means of control that we can. Just going out and hiring a company, you know, and they say they do it when the pollinators are not active, but pollinators are active during the workday, and I don't see these companies out at night. So, you know, even if the pollinators aren't flying, it's getting, you know, they could be taking habitat in plants and leaves and things and still be exposed. It's not a good practice, I don't think, for general people. Yeah, and there's much better ways of controlling mosquitoes. Just get the water out of your yard. Your standing water
absolutely
goes a long, long way to solving that problem.
And addressing it early. I mean, you're really going to kind of, from my understanding, if you use mosquito dunks, address that water issue very early on, you're going to knock sort of like that curve. We're all becoming very familiar with curves these days, is going to be lower down the road. So it's, yeah.
So on the subject of mosquitoes, people are chatting in about that, and somebody asked about ladybugs, and I know
that's Dom.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it was something that was new to me. I walk in the greenhouse and I see all these little white mites everywhere, these little funny looking bugs. And before I knew what they were, I just started Googling stuff, and it would say spray with hot water. And it's like, I'm spraying them and it seems like they're just staying there. So, you know, I did now the first time I released the ladybugs, I think they all just moved out like the next day because they didn't do anything. But then the next batch, they got in there that night, they got real comfortable. And then within a couple of days, you could see them kind of, you know, finding the heavily affected plants. So, You know, that only had to happen one time. I mean, it only takes one time for you to figure out how to, you know, create that curve. So, you know, now we do things like we'll spray neem oil in the greenhouse at times and stuff like that. But, you know, knocking on wood, we haven't had that issue this season. So I'm inclined to believe that the ladybugs were very helpful in that situation.
And I think that's the general consensus for indoor environments. So in a greenhouse or hoop house, you know, a controlled environment where you have these explosions of soft-bodied insects, that's where ladybugs are really great. I'm thinking, what I'm hearing mostly these days is it's not recommended to buy in ladybugs to release in your yard. They're not going to succeed very well. They might not survive, and they won't do that much of a job controlling your pests in the landscape.
I think all this does speak to sort of how, you know, when you think about, you know, the number of eggs and offspring a single insect can produce, you know, catching it when you can, you know, there's I think if it's gone too far, you're not going to win that battle. But when you think about sort of like the ecological complexity of the natural world around us, but also of a garden, you have these insects that have evolved to essentially, you know, emerge seasonally at the exact time when these other insects that are potentially bad insects, you know, so it just comes back to sort of fostering that degree of complexity where you have you're almost cultivating this toolbox that's already out there in the natural world so that they can work hard and live their lives, and hopefully you don't have to.
You know, I was thinking, you know, the predator pest or predator prey, you know, relationship is interesting because, you know, by the very nature, you know, the prey type organisms breed and reproduce so much faster than the predators do. So whether it's mice and cats, you know, or rabbits and hawks, you know, I think of, you know, insect populations in those terms. Aphids are just going to explode real fast, and then the predator insects come along, and it takes there's a little lag time before their numbers kind of catch up, and but they do, you know, and they take care of it. And the predator will eat many more, you know, pest insects than just one for itself. You know, it's feeding, it's taking care of it. And what happens if you come in and you see a pest population and you spray a pesticide? Yeah, you wipe out those pests mostly, but you also wipe out the beneficial predatory insects. And now you start all over again because, you know, it doesn't take very long for that pest population to just explode again. And now you're back to ground zero with your prey or predators. So it's complex and it's interesting. And, you know, I think in a more disturbed landscape, it favors the pest insects big time. It just always does. Whereas in a better landscape with a diversity of plants, with a minimum or no pesticide use, that balance is much easier to keep, much quicker to respond.
So do you ever use sort of like try to trick the insects? Like you're not very successful getting rid of them, but maybe you can attract them to another part of your garden, or are there any strategies like that that you use to sort of put them in a different direction?
Yeah, Jen, right now, all of her borders, she has nasturtiums, which are often used as a sacrificial plant. And I can't speak to the effectiveness. They're also beautiful and fun. So it's a win-win situation if you ask me, but I think that really does happen. Yeah, especially with, you know, like cucumbers, things like that.
I really don't know. This is one I'm going to punt on. It's just, you know, I've seen where if you plant marigolds, it'll keep something away. And then I see plants filled with that stuff. And, you know, but I just don't know. I just, rather than go for gimmicky things or, you know, those are fun to try, and why not, you know, do it. Nasturtiums are a great plant. Why not try it, you know? But what I feel like is really reliable and what works is just having a lot of different plants in your garden and in your community.
From my understanding also, I mean, you know, having like really good soil, I mean, you're going to have a microscopic sort of web of, you know, you've got nematodes, you've got all kinds of microorganisms. You just have, it's going to be, I think what you're trying to look for here is just a balance.
I
Because
agree
that's
with that 100%. You know, a healthier plant is better at warding off, you know, pests. And, you know, a healthier plant is almost invariably, because it's receiving all the things it needs, the nutrients, the oxygen and water in the soil, you know, the right amount of sunlight. So the you know, good soil is a great start, a very important thing. So the more you have those things, the healthier the plants are. And again, you know, the plants themselves are actually doing a lot of the work to protect themselves from pests. And then you again, on top of that, you have your beneficials. You know, that's the way it's supposed to work.
That's a great point to think about. I mean, we think about it with humans and bodies, right? That, you know, the healthier you are, the better job you'll be able to do at fighting off disease. And the same could be true is true with plants and insects. Are there bugs that people get really freaked out about that they see on their plants that are really just fine to let them go?
I think that alien caterpillar that Sid was talking about yesterday. Those are just scary to look at.
yeah, you know,
When you're
parasitic
reaching down to pick up a tomato and that thing pops out at you, it's gonna give you a jolt when you see it. So, but yeah, it's just one of those things that once you get to know it, it's not so bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think wasps get a bad rap, but yeah, parasitic wasps, for example, you know, are I really don't think there are too many bad bugs. There's just too many of a bug in a world of an insect in a way. But yeah, they might give you the creepy crawlies. Just a side note, you're not going to like this, Dominique, but I feel like I should share it with you anyway because somebody shared it with me after our spot yesterday. That they've actually just recently discovered parasitic wasps, a whole new set of them in the rainforest, I think in the tropics, that actually, and this is also going to cut into your love of spiders, just a warning, okay, that they're parasitic. They also control their host. So they infect these spiders. They're young, their larvae are going to eat these spiders, but they've managed to change the spider's behavior. So the spider, instead of like weaving a web like a spider's supposed to do, you know, Charlotte's Web, is now creating actually like the infrastructure they need for their larva. I mean, that's like some next level stuff.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's only gonna add to the nightmares that's gonna give me. That's fascinating. That is fascinating.
I think a lot of people are very afraid of stinging insects, you know, especially wasps and what's the word? The not wasps, not bees, but the other one, hornets, or they you know, because they're afraid of being stung. And the fact is I have literally tried to provoke feeding insects, bees, wasps, hornets, to sting me when they're feeding, you know, on a really busy plant. You've seen that, where just covered with stuff, everything from tiny little wasps to big ones. And I've gone in there and slapped them around, pushed them, shoved them, called them names, you know, and I have never gotten stung. I've done that over and over and over in front of people. I'm getting real cocky about it now. One of these days it's gonna catch up to me, but they're not interested. They just want to fly away and go to the next flower and feed. They really only want to sting you if you step on one, you drink it in a soda can, or you get too near their nest. That's when they're defensive and will strike. But, you know, people afraid of bees and wasps, you know, on their pollinator plants or in their gardens, really have almost nothing to be afraid of if they wear shoes and don't drink soda while they're out there.
I'd like to throw out too, flies, Diptera. I mean, it's
Oh
actually
yeah.
this extremely diverse kingdom, well, not kingdom, sorry, group of insects that we tend to have this revulsion to flies, but at the same time, you'll see so many of them also doing the work of pollination, so many of them that are actually quite beautiful. I'm kind of fascinated most recently by this fly for the aura of mystery surrounding it. The golden backed snipe fly, if I've got it correctly. And it just comes out at a very specific time. They think it breeds basically in rotting wood, but they think it feeds on aphids. They just don't even actually fully understand what these things do. And they're beautiful. They're like this very dark black, but like lacy body with like this bright gold daub on the back. And, it just demonstrates sort of the very timely succession of populations in your garden. They probably are eating aphids. And so the hope is, if they're knocking out your aphids nice and early on, and they're partly there because you're totally cool with like leaving a big pile of rotting wood in the back of your yard, or lazy like me, then more power to them. And it's like there are so many other flies that are just we see these metallic flies, and it's just interesting to me that we experience such many of us were grossed out by certain insects, but then like ladybugs, they're cute and nice. It's just an interesting sort of aspect of our interaction with the natural world. But
like you said, most people I think of associate flies with house flies, and yeah, that's kind of a disgusting one, so let's face it. But that's the flies that act and look like house flies are very, very small in that big group of insects. And so many of them are, like you said, are just beautiful insects. A lot of them mimic bees because they don't have stingers, but they want you to think they have a stinger. So some really really cool stuff going on there, and it's a huge order or family of insects, massive number of species.
And from my understanding, many of the ones that you're seeing on your flowers, they're pollinating, they're consuming nectar, but they're also often predatory. So they're kind of occupying multiple roles.
Yeah, they're kind of like us. They like fruit and a little bit of meat sometimes, or maybe a lot of meat sometimes, as the case may be.
Well, we have some questions from the audience that I want to get to, but before we start with the Q&A, are there any thoughts that any of you wanted to mention that we didn't get to?
I'm fascinated by what Domonique does, having, working indoors in a hydroponic setting. I know that people that work in that sort of setting, they're very highly attuned to like the inputs and the outputs of their gardens, which is something that I think lots of gardeners think of in terms of like, your nutrients that are going in and what's coming out. This is just kind of a rambling thought, but it's just, that is a way of thinking about growing things and understanding that sort of taking this scorched earth approach to a garden. And I'm not just talking about pesticides, but this impulse where people want to garden, they just want everything to be neat with lots of space in between everything. It's just not, you're not doing what you could do. Like you want density. Scott will tell you want layers, you want you want this lushness, and it might be a little bit of a scary change, but I think ultimately it's more beautiful and more rewarding for everybody and healthier for everybody too.
Absolutely.
And it's funny because this last year in the middle of a pandemic was the first year that our organization actually stretched our legs at outdoor production, right? So what I found was in trying to control my environment indoors, I had to really know everything that the plant needed, right? Because you want to try to mimic a perfect situation for the plant. So you're learning everything about this plant and the insects that it might need or doesn't need and stuff like that. What I found was once we got outside, when I would get hit with certain things, I would be able to draw a link to, okay, well, indoors, I was trying to add this so that I could attract that, or vice versa. So it kind of made things a little bit less intimidating when we got outside. But, again, the way I learned to grow food was it was really just repetition. You know, I would see things over and over again, not really understanding it, but, you know, pulling, like this year, you know, I've got 60 something fruit trees in Bond Hill. And when everybody started talking about cicadas coming, everybody was calling me. Like, people were sending me emails saying, use this netting. My operating partners were actually like buying netting and stuff. And I went out there and I thought, there's no way I'm going to try to net 65 fruit trees. So it was just one of those things where I thought, you know, survival of the fittest, right? If these cicadas show up and mess with my trees, then that's what nature intended. I didn't have one single cicada in Bond Hill. So it's another one of those things where it's like, okay, why did I see them literally everywhere in Madisonville? I didn't have one problem in Bond Hill. The neighborhoods aren't that far apart. So again, it's just another one of those interesting things about how the insect world works, because you just assume if you're outside, you're going to see the same insect everywhere. It's not the case. And that's something that was very interesting to find out this year, especially when it comes to, you know, the big cicada scare. But they didn't mess with any of our fruit trees, so I don't know what that's about.
It's like, you know, with something like cicadas, actually with a lot of these things, and like your story about your grandfather, it's a, you know, don't ignore the old timers, because you know, I could have told you I was in the two cicada generations ago, and damn, I'm old. I'm sorry, but you know, I had apple trees I had just planted, and I did more damage, I'm sure of it, by trying to protect them,
Right.
the cicadas would have done on their own. So yeah, look for that old knowledge, and you know, and that's kind of one of the scary things about this whole drunken pesticide period that we've gone through, is that kind of wiped out the old knowledge on how to deal with a lot of these things. I do also want to acknowledge that a real good friend of mine, Nan Plunkett, called me out on my nectar is just nectar and pollen is just pollen quote. You know, and I have heard that from really smart people, PhDs and things, but Nan is really smart, and she's saying, and she's into this stuff deep. She probably, you know, reads about it, lives it way more than I ever do, saying that pollen from different plants have different proteins, and those are specific to many pollinators. So it just goes to show, I mean, we all have so much to learn, and this is important stuff to learn. I really hope science addresses this in a bigger and better way.
You know, and all this makes you wish that our city had a specifically botanical library that you could go to find like the information that you needed.
Yeah.
Maybe the Lloyd Library.
Oh yeah, the Lloyd. Exactly.
Well, there were a few questions that I didn't drop in during the conversation, and some of them did have to do with mosquitoes when we were on that mosquito topic. Michael says that he bought a Japanese beetle hormone trap, and it attracted everyone from miles around and seemed to make the problem much worse. Do you guys know anything about these Japanese beetle hormone traps?
I think probably these other gentlemen might, but I just would like to say next time I'm going to prank somebody, I'm definitely going to try attaching one of those to their bumper or something like that.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, you know, I see these things all the time where it's like, you know, these traps and stuff, and I instantly think to myself, well, I don't want them coming towards the area, so why would I put a headquarters right there in the middle of it to attract them? So
it's much smarter to put it in your neighbor's yard, you know?
Right. Send them somewhere else, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
That seems like that would be the best solution if you're going to use a trap.
I think they can be a little bit effective. I mean, you often do see them, you know, burrowing into flowers. So, I mean, if they are, you know, I really don't know, but yeah.
It's interesting that their numbers tend to fluctuate. When they first arrived here, was about the same time we moved into the house we're in now, and there was a wild grape growing along the fence, and it was just every year covered with Japanese beetles. And I would say for the past 5, maybe 10 years now, it's rare to see one. There were years I didn't see any at all, and then and lately I've been seeing maybe 2, 3, you know, a year. And maybe this year, maybe even a little bit more more than that. So they might be on their way up. I noticed that when about the time that the Japanese beetles disappeared, we had a big flock of starlings in the area. And then once they were gone, we didn't have the starlings anymore. So is it coincidence? I don't know. But, you know, it was one of those invader insects that came, didn't have any natural predators, exploded, and then kind of, you know, some predators, some you know, things kind of found it, and
Yeah.
sort of, it reduced its numbers.
And that's you bring up a great point too, which is, you know, in controlling insects, you can look beyond other insects in terms of, you know, making your yard appealing to birds, which will actually help control insect populations also.
So we have still some more mosquito questions. Are mosquitoes pollinators?
Yes,
Oh,
they are.
Oh, we have a yes and a no.
Who said no?
I said no, but I it was just a gut level. I didn't. Why would they be pollinators? But go ahead.
I was just told recently that they were pollinators, so I need to do some more research.
Who told you? Was it a reliable source?
I think it was. I'm gonna have to go back and look that up, and then we should make this interesting. And one of us will have to buy the other one a beer if that works for you.
Totally.
Okay.
And
I just want to know the
snack.
answer. Just make sure I know the answer, because I was waiting patiently for someone to have to answer that question.
So Tess, I'm sorry if I'm mangling your last name. I'm not gonna say your last name, but we do have somebody in the comment section who says the males drink nectar, mosquitoes.
And yeah, as long as some pollen falls on their bodies and they move, then conceivably they could pollinate plants.
Sweet. Scott owes me a beer.
Yeah, damn it. You know, they're not built for it. They don't have the fuzzy, you know, the hairs that bees have gotten, the that butterflies have. But, you know, there's not a whole lot of fuzz on a hummingbird's face either. So, you know, on its bill and its tongue. So it could happen, I suppose.
Yeah,
Beetles are a pollinator in some cases like that, you know, especially the primitive plants kind of depend a lot of times on beetles to do the pollination work, because beetles were doing that with the primitive flowers long before bees even evolved. So older flowers, flowers that were here in dinosaur times, you know, magnolias and water lilies and calycanthus and things like that, pawpaws. While bees have kind of figured them out a little bit, originally it was beetles all the time, and to some extent it still is beetles.
So a couple more things on the mosquito topic. Somebody asked about bat houses and also using mosquito dunks in bird baths.
I am 1000% pro mosquito dunks. Those things work. They're safe. You're just essentially using, I believe, a bacterium that's going to impede the growth of the larvae. I'm not sure how they work, but it's a great investment, and it's a great because, you know, practically sometimes it's just not practical to completely control all the the breeding grounds of mosquitoes, especially when you live in Cincinnati, where we now have a monsoon season in July, apparently.
In bat houses?
I think they're a pretty cool idea. I've got very limited experience with them. They still need to be where there's good bat habitat. You have to have them somewhere near water. I think people are saying that it's really important to practice hygiene with them, clean them out I guess in the winter time or time to time. Same with a lot of the bee houses, because pathogens can build up over time. I'd like to think they work great. I don't have firsthand experience though.
I don't like bats, so
Dominic.
Not an option for me.
You'll deal with the mosquitoes, right?
Yeah, it's just a few mosquito bites.
I like bats, and I do like the idea of creating habitats for wildlife. And like as was just said, you know, that's a great idea, but when you're doing that, there comes a certain responsibility with that, and you could be creating a situation where disease can spread. With bee hotels, it's really important to get the right types of bee hotels, because the materials aren't right, you're not actually doing the bees any favors. So, you know, I think probably I would just recommend that if you're interested in creating habitat through any sort of house for any sort of creature, that you do as much research as possible. There's a wealth of it out there.
And that comes down a lot of times to what, you know, your wood piles and unkempt areas maybe of your yard or of wild places, tree snags, things like that are that natural habitat, that, you know, a lot of times we're just a little too fastidious for our own good, you know, run out there and clean it up for no real reason other than we think we need to, and in doing so we ruin a lot of habitat for some great wildlife. You know, old wood piles, if you ever kind of gone through an old wood pile, it's like a reef, you know, it's a coral reef. It's just full of all kinds of wildlife, insects, creepy crawlies that Domonique would probably run from. But you know, it from a purely wildlife ecosystem point of view, just awesome places.
Well, let's not clean out those wood piles then. I'm all for that as well.
Yeah.
I want to thank the three of you for joining us tonight. I've learned so much. I love going to Dom's gardens. I've never been to Scott's or Cedric's, but I might use this as an excuse to sort of worm my way over. I do want to thank also the audience. Great questions. And I also want to let you know that we've got another bug-related program that's coming up. Many of you know Gene Kritsky, the cicada guy. Turns out he's also a bee expert and specifically has done research on ancient Egypt's beekeepers. So he will be joining us for a program on July 28th at 7 p.m. You can go to lloydlibrary.org and register for that. And we hope to see you for another program. This program will also be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So if you have friends that are interested, be sure and share it with them, or if you want to come and watch it again. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you for hosting this, Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cedric, I guess I owe you a beer.
No, I just want to buy you one, Scott. And I'd love to buy you one too, Dominique. And we should all do it sometime.
Yes, sir. Let's do it. Let me know, guys.
Cheers.
Thank you. See ya.
See you later. Bye-bye.